Hey, let me encourage you, if you would, go ahead and take your Bibles and turn to the book of John in the 4th chapter, and that's where we're going to be in a moment. Yes, I do realize this is a J.J. Watt jersey, and yes, I realize I'm not as tall as he is. It doesn't matter if you tell me that. Several people have told me that many times today already. Thank you. And I mean it sarcastically. Hey, all you negative Nancys out there that think the Texans aren't going to win, just keep it to yourself. I'm a believer that the Texans are going to win and LSU tomorrow night. So I just thought I'd say that. Hey, we've been in a series called Hindsight 2020. In fact, we just started last week. Hindsight 2020. Now, what you may not realize is that phrase, hindsight 2020, actually has a negative connotation to it. Now, we don't necessarily say that openly, though I'm going to be negative, but it's really when we use that thought process of hindsight is 2020, it's often in a negative connotation. Here's what I mean by that. It never fails that after you have done something that maybe didn't turn out right, you have those lovingly people, sarcasm implied, loving people who come to you and say, wow, I bet you'd do that differently next time, wouldn't you? Or, hey, bet you didn't see that happening. That's hindsight 2020. It's easy to look back at something and go, wow, I wish you'd done that. And we've all experienced that. Let's just admit it. We've all experienced this idea that we wish we could go back and do something differently. I mean, let's just take, for instance, last year, 2019. I don't want anybody to speak out loud, but I guarantee you there's things that you experienced or decisions you made or things you were involved in that if you had a do-over, you'd do it differently. You would. Now, here's the truth. There's nothing you can do to go back and change last year. I know you'd like to think you could, but there's nothing. You can't go back and redo those things. And so what I want to do is, I hope we're doing through this series, is take what could be a potentially negative thing, which is hindsight 2020, and turn it to a positive. And that is, okay, I can't go back and change what I did wrong or had a horrible experience with last year, but in the new year, 2020, I'm going to purpose to do something different in my life that I wished I had done last year. Maybe even learned from the mistakes of last year. All right? So I want to share a number with you this morning. Now, I realize what I'm about to share with you can be kind of heavy, but I think it's important that we see this number. The first number I would share with you is this number right here. Anybody, everybody knows what that number is, right? What is it? 55 million. 55 million. That's a big number. It's a big number. And that number, again, I'm not trying to be hard, but this number represents how many people will die worldwide in 2020. On average, every year for the past several years, give or take 100,000 or so, 55, I think it's actually the number would be 55,600,000, but I went down. 55 million plus people will die either because of natural causes or unnatural, okay? Their lives will expire. It's kind of a hard thing to think about. So I started running that number around in my head, and I began wondering, well, I wonder how many of those people, 55 million, could potentially be believers, Christians. I mean, how many? Give us some hope, right? So statistics that I read and checked into pretty much all agree that those who claim to be Christians, now, again, we don't know if everybody's on the same playing field theologically, but those who claim to be Christians across the world is about 31% of people claim to be Christians around the world. So if that's true, roughly, again, I'm not a mathematician, but roughly, that means 16,500,000 people will die and their eternity will be in Christ. If they believe, you get what I'm trying to say. But here's the number that bothers me. That leaves 38,500,000 people that when they die this year, they will spend an eternity without Christ. Just let that sink in for just a moment. Worldwide, 38 million people. If according to what we believe Scripture teaches us, will spend an eternity separated from God in what we know as hell. So the question I have for you relates to this number, and it's this. In 2020, would you purpose to impact someone's life for eternity? In 2020, will you purpose to impact someone's eternity? If we know, and I get it, I know this is an overwhelming number, 38 million. I mean, it's an incredible number. But if we have to understand that there's a certain percentage of that 38 million that lives right here. In fact, it was several years ago, a local church, I'm sure the numbers changed somewhat, again, not big time, but it's changed somewhat. A local church wanted to know, so they called every church in the city of Baytown, and said, on average, how many people do you have attend your church every weekend? I mean, not just Baptist or Methodist, they did everybody. Catholic, Pentecostal, Assembly of God, every little church, I guess not house churches, but the majority of the churches they knew, they called them, how many do you have in attendance? And they ran it against the population number of Baytown, and they came up, this was several years ago, that 90% of the people in our community did not attend a church on a given weekend. 90%. So we know, I'm not saying that everybody that doesn't go to church is lost and going to hell. I'm not trying to make that implication. But I think we can safely assume that a vast majority of those who have no connection with church probably have no connection with Christ. And so we can throw this 38 million number out there, but we have to understand that even applies to right here. It's people that you work with. It's people that you do life with. It's people that your kids play sports with. It's your next door neighbors. Do they have a relationship with Jesus? Have they ever engaged with God? And so the question is, in 2020, will you purpose to impact someone's eternity for Christ? I ask you to turn to John chapter 4. I'm going to begin reading with verse 1. I'm going to read a lot of verses, so hang with me. I just want you to get a good glimpse of this story. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. That's high noon. A woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Could you give me a drink?" For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" For Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water?" And can I just tell you that she was being just a tad bit sarcastic in her statement there. "Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again." But notice the change in verbiage, pronouns. "But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty and have to come here to draw water." So Jesus says to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." So Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying you have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you is not your husband." She says, "What you have said is true." Or he says, "What you have said is true." And the woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive you're a prophet," which is obvious because he basically threw open the curtains of her life right there to her. He says, I perceive that you're a prophet. And so she says, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." She's changing the subject. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem you will worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews," not speaking of the religion, but of Christ. "But the hour is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship Him. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, I know that the Messiah is coming, He who is called Christ. When He comes, He will tell us all things." And Jesus says to her, "I who speak to you am He." Interesting encounter that Jesus has. Now, I do not have the time today to go into all the little details theologically that's in this story because there's a lot. But I want to make 3 real quick personal applications to potentially answer the question that I asked at the beginning in relationship to this number of 38 million. And that is, in 2020, will you, I'm not talking about it's me too, but would we purposefully choose to impact someone's eternity? What does that look like? Well, from this story, there's 3 things. First thing is this. You need to choose to encounter people where they are. You need to choose to encounter people where they are. I love this number. It's kind of been a solid number for us over the years. When people respond to a survey, first-time guests, when they respond to a survey, we ask them, how did you hear about Second, or why did you come to Second, or whatever the decision may be. And the vast majority, I think like 85% of the people that respond to that question say, "A friend invited me." And I love that. And I just say to you, keep inviting them, right? Keep inviting your friends. Just keep telling folks to come and see. I hope that you'll continue to do that. But here's what I want to say is that we have to take a second step, and that is we have to be willing to go where people are. It's a great thing. You ought to invite your friends, but when your friends come, they don't know the rules. They don't know how church works. For some of you, it comes like second nature because you've been going to church all your life. Oh, this is where you stand. This is where you sit. This is where you clap. This is where you don't. is where, we know where the red bucket is. We know what the red bucket stands for and all those kind of things. If you've been coming here long enough, we have our own little things that we do here, even at Second, that we just assume people know. And when someone comes in off the street, never been in church before, it can be nerve-wracking. And don't get me wrong, keep inviting. But here's the question. As a follower of Christ, at what point are you going to go where the people are? When are you going to go encounter them on their home turf? Because that's exactly what Jesus did. In the story, just real quick, in the story, I'll give you the snapshot. Jesus, there's a potential conflict arising with Jesus and the Pharisees, and not that he was afraid of conflict with the Pharisees. This wasn't the time or the place. So he says, I'm out of here. I'm on my way to Galilee. But in the midst of the trip, it says, and the story says, he must go or he will go through Samaria. Now, that's a really interesting statement for a Jew to say that they're going to go through Samaria. Because if you know, and I'm telling you, most Jews avoided Samaria. As the woman even alludes to. Why are you speaking to me? Number one, a woman, but number two, a Samaritan. You shouldn't even be talking to me. This is not what Jewish men do. Jews don't associate with Samaritans. So typically what would happen is when someone was traveling, particularly on the journey that Jesus was on, they had to go from one place to another, and Samaria happened to be the shortest route. They would actually go around Samaria. It'd be like today if you had to go somewhere and you pulled up Google Maps on your phone. We've all done this. Pull up a map and you say, give me directions. And typically it gives you like 3 or 4 options. And there's always one that's like, this will take you, 10 minutes longer. And I mean, how many in the room go, well, I want to take longer. Yeah, I'll do that route. I was hoping you would give me the longest route possible because that's the one I'm like, no, we always go the shortest route. The shortest route from where Jesus was to where he was going was through Samaria, but most Jews would go around. He went to where she was. Here's what I really believe. Because I believe this about Christ. From the moment he started his ministry until he laid himself down on the cross, every step that he took was towards the cross. Purposeful. Jesus knew when he was leaving towards Galilee, he was avoiding conflict, but he also knew he had an appointment with a woman who was on her 6th boyfriend / husband who needed to hear the good news of the gospel. He knew that she was going to be there at noon, and he purposed in his heart that he was going to be there where she was. Maybe this year you could purpose in your heart that you're going to go to a conference or plan a meal or go to a sporting event or whatever it may be where you can encounter someone that ultimately you go for the purpose of sharing the good news, but you have to purpose in your heart the willingness to encounter where people are. And you can go places I can't go. I can go places you can go. You can't go. You have influence over people that I wouldn't have influence over, and vice versa. But Jesus purposefully went through Samaria to encounter a woman sitting at a well that most people who were Jewish would not encounter. Which brings me to my second thought, and it's this. Would you be willing to have a conversation with someone who's far away from Christ? Would you be willing to have a conversation? I know that sounds kind of silly, but Jesus initiates a conversation with her, which was very unusual. And number one, it was unusual for a young woman to be showing up at a well at high noon. They typically didn't go draw water at high noon. They went early in the morning. But as we read on the story, we hear about her past. We hear about how she hadn't really made some great decisions. And trust me, if Jesus knew about it, the community knew about it. And the community was probably talking about it. That's probably why she was there at noon, because she didn't want to be around all the gossips. It was easier for her to go get water at noon than to deal with all the people. But Jesus encounters her, but he also initiates conversation. Would you give me something to drink? He spoke to her at where she was. If you notice, I mean, they have a conversation about water. Well, why? Because they're sitting at a well and she's looking for water, and Jesus ties it into the gospel of living water. See, are you willing to have that conversation where you get into a conversation with someone to be able to talk to them ultimately about the gospel, but you have to engage them where they're at? Once again, you could probably have a conversation with someone that I may not be able to have a conversation with. It's like I've told you before, I don't always introduce myself. I don't want to offend you. I don't introduce myself as a pastor. And it kind of bugs me when people do that because automatically walls go up when people find out I'm a preacher. I mean, just... But you have ability to have conversation with people. Here's what's hard, and I know this sounds like a simplistic point. Are you willing to have a conversation? And the reason I bring it up is because, to me, this is one thing that we're not able to do in America today is have conversation. Number one, because conversation, 50% of conversation is listening, and we're not listening to one another. Typically, when we're in a conversation, all we're doing is we're trying to think of what our response is going to be or what our story is going to be because we got to one-up the other person instead of just listening to what they're saying. I came across a quote. You might have seen it before. I came across this quote from Rick Warren recently. It says this: "Our culture has accepted two huge lies. The first is that if you disagree with someone's lifestyle, you must fear or hate them. If you disagree with their lifestyle, you must fear or hate them. The second is that to love someone means you agree with everything they believe or do. Both are nonsense. You don't have to compromise convictions to be compassionate." I love that statement. And I've wrestled with it. Because in a minute, I'm going to talk about this idea of speaking the truth. And I love to be a truth teller. I don't necessarily tell my truth in love like I should. So I've wrestled with this. And it does get frustrating because we don't listen to people. And so we tend to disagree with people on things. But a lot of times when we disagree because the other people aren't listening to us, they immediately equate our disagreement to hatred or fear. Then the truth is, not everybody, even in this room, is going to agree on everything. I mean, anybody married? Come on, right? Not everybody's going to agree on everything. But it doesn't mean if Susan and I disagree, it doesn't mean I hate her or she hates me or I'm afraid of her or she's afraid of me. We can disagree. The same is true with just this other idea of thinking that, to love someone means that you have to agree with everything that they do or believe. That's so untrue. But we have to just be willing to have a conversation. We have to be willing to talk with folks. And a big part of that is listening. Just listening. You know what's interesting is that oftentimes I've been doing this daily devotional deal on an app, and it was about crucial conversations. And one of the big things that they talked about is this idea of how we don't, when we enter into a conversation, oftentimes we are so biased about that conversation because we have preconceived ideas of what the other person believes or feels or whatever before we even have a conversation because we've already determined it in our hearts and in our minds. And so we enter into that conversation without even listening to what they have to say because we've already determined how they believe and how they feel, and we haven't even heard how they believe or how they feel. Are we willing to just simply have a conversation? Jesus was willing. You know what's interesting is Jesus shouldn't have been talking to a Samaritan woman. Jews didn't. In fact, I read this. This is so funny. There's actually Jewish rabbis, because Jesus is considered a rabbi, a teacher. There are Jewish rabbis. I forget the exact term. It's like they're called the bruised and bleeding teachers or something like that, or bleeding and bruised teachers, because these guys are so dogmatic about their religion, about not doing things in the wrong way. One of the things is that a Jewish man should not even look on a woman, like sometimes not even his own wife. And so these dudes, they wrap their heads with their robes so low that they walk around, they run into walls and like bust their nose because they're being so religious. That's kind of funny, isn't it? I thought it was. But Jesus shouldn't have even been talking. He shouldn't have been having a conversation with this lady. We're going to learn a lot having a conversation. You know, Jesus met with a man at night. Nicodemus at night, but he met with a woman in the middle of the day. By the way, guys, that's a good lesson. You know? Anyway, Jesus has this conversation. She even acknowledges, why are you even talking to me? You shouldn't even be talking to me. But he was willing to have the conversation. Final thing, let me share this real quick and I'll wrap it up. He says, are you willing to go where they are? Are you willing to have the conversation? The third thing is, are you willing to just speak truth? Jesus just spoke truth to this girl. He didn't beat her up. I mean, he spoke truth. Hey, go get your husband. Well, I don't have a husband. Well, you're right. You had 5, and the one you're with now is not yours. I mean, that's kind of hard, but it's truth. He spoke truth. He talked about living water and how people who don't have the living water will thirst again. She didn't fully understand all that. That's why she says, hey, the Messiah's going to come and he's going to tell us all these things. Hey, I'm here. But he spoke the truth. He didn't beat her over the head with it. He just simply spoke the truth. See, I think sometimes we really like the verse that says, speak the truth. But we forget the latter part of it says, in love. I'll just confess, I'm a real big proponent of truth. And sometimes I like really speaking the truth, and I don't do it in love, though. That's something I wrestle with. We can speak the truth, but do we really care about the person that we're speaking the truth to, or are we just trying to point something out so we can embarrass them? Is there a point that we're trying to get to of hope and assurance? And what Jesus was moving towards is salvation. He had to get her to see her sin and then be able to respond to that sin. How do we know her life was changed? Here's kind of the secondary thought. I'll wrap things up. He was willing to go where she was. He was willing to have the conversation. He was willing to speak the truth. And here's the result. If you read the rest of the story, the woman goes into town and she says, you got to come and see this dude who told me my whole life. You got to come and see. It's kind of like what I was telling you. I love the fact that you say, come and see, come a second, come sometime. She said, come and see this man who told me everything about my life. And so all these Samaritans don't mess with Jews. All these Samaritans come out to the well and they give their lives to Christ. Their lives are forever changed. See, 38 million is an overwhelming number, but it always begins with one. Just one. Jesus went to where the Samaritan woman was. He dared to have the conversation, and he spoke truth to her. And because that one was impacted by the message, many other Samaritans were impacted by the same message. I just wonder what could happen if all of us in 2020 decided that we could potentially be used to impact someone's eternity. It could be life-changing for them and for us. Would you stand in prayer with me? God, I thank you so much for today. I thank you for just the story that we were able to read from Scripture. And God, I know there's so much more there. But Lord, I pray that you would just kind of use your word to kind of roll around in our hearts and lives and reveal yourself to us in the way that I could never do. God, I thank you for everyone that's here. I thank you, God, as we all kind of wrestle with this reality that there are people who are dying and spending an eternity separated from you and your Son, that, God, we would want to do something about that. That we would purpose in our hearts that we would want to impact someone's eternity this year. And so, God, as people are considering that, I pray that you would just speak to their hearts about what that looks like for them. and how they accomplish that goal. With heads bowed and eyes closed, I always like to give an opportunity, because I believe maybe you came today with a burden, and you were hoping there would be someone that would pray with you or maybe pray for you. Maybe it's something you encountered this week or in the past month, something that's just been overwhelming that you don't even know what to say. And so you're just like, could you pray? And there's people down here at the front, and then even to my right and your left, there's a prayer flag in the back, and there's people back there that if you don't feel comfortable coming in the front, they're back there and they'll pray with you. If that's the minimum of what we do, we would love to be able to have that opportunity. But the team is going to sing, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to just respond to God. In a minute, we'll join them in singing, but if we can pray with you, just step out and come right